My name is Anaya, and I'm your host today as we explore the minds of infamous serial killers. In this season, we are going to talk about serial killers that inspired famous movies. Today, we're going inside the mind of the Milwaukee Monster, also known as Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey inspired the movies Dahmer and My Friend Dahmer. A friendly reminder that this podcast contains graphic material such as homicide, sexual assault, and violence. This content might leave you upset and scared. If this will impact you in a negative way, then please do not continue watching. With that being said, to all the people that stayed, let's dive into this horror turned into reality. Jeffrey's full name was Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer. He was born May 21st in 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He was the firstborn child of Joyce Flint and Lionel Dahmer. Let's get into Joyce first. Joyce was a teletype machine instructor. But the most important thing is that Joyce suffered from depression, and she was also a hypochondriac. Her husband at the time, Lionel, described her as an attention craver who constantly needed attention from everybody. She also spent most of her time in bed and attempted suicide on multiple accounts. This affected Dahmer because his mom was around, but she wasn't really around emotionally because she was going through her own things. Now let's get into Lionel. He was a research chemist, and he was also gone because he had to research, study to be a chemist. So he was also away from Dahmer in his early years. So the most crucial parts of Dahmer's life, he kind of really didn't have his parents there, and it was like a neglect. He even said that he was unsure of the solidity of the family. He just felt a very tense, harsh environment in the house. They were arguing a lot. It really affected him, especially since it happened in his early years. For the most part, in Dahmer's really early years, he was described as a really happy and energetic person until he had surgery because he had a double hernia. After that, he became really quiet and timid, and his teacher noticed this, and she said he might have abandonment issues. Like, she sensed it in him because of his quiet nature and the way he just changed so suddenly that, it really affected him. Something was going on at home. In October of 1966, Jeffrey and his family moved to Doylestown, Ohio. And while in Doylestown, Ohio, Joyce gave birth to a baby boy, and Jeffrey was allowed to pick the name of his sibling, so he chose the name David. When Joyce gave birth, her symptoms just increased. It was like postpartum depression. She she really was going through it, and Jeffrey really was sensing that there was something wrong. The lack of presence from both of his parents, it really affected him in a negative way. But we're gonna dive into that more later. Let's get into Jeffrey now. At the age of 4, Jeffrey saw his father removing animal bones from the family house. And when Jeffrey saw this, he was so excited because to him the bones, they made a nice sound, and he called the bones fiddlesticks. This kind of, excitement turned into a fascination, which eventually turned into an obsession with bones. And every so often, he would look for bones at the family house. The family moved again to Bath Township, Summit County, Ohio. This was their third address in 2 years, which is a lot of moving for a family. This new home had a lot of wooded area surrounding it, and there was also like a hut just like a small distance from the house. This hut would play a major role in Jeffrey's life because he would collect insects such as dragonflies, moths, etc., and also small animals like squirrels and stuff. And he will put them in jars of formaldehyde and keep them in the hut, kind of so he can preserve the bones. And in 1970, so 2 years after they moved, during a dinner, Jeffrey asked what would happen if chicken bones were placed in bleach, and his father was like excited that Jeffrey was interested in the science part of chicken, but his father didn't know that it was an obsession with the bones and not just wanting to know science. But since his father didn't know, his father taught him how to preserve animal bones in bleach, which Jeffrey would use later down the line. Jeffrey used this method and he preserved the animals that he collected, and he also took roadkill and dissected it and buried it like beside the hut. This was a major red flag that no one really noticed because no one knew how deep Jeffrey's obsession had gone. But in 1975, it only got worse. Jeffrey decapitated the head of a dog carcass and he nailed the body to a tree, and he impaled the skull with a stick and showed his friend because he thought it was so funny and said it was a prank. And I don't know about you, but if I was the friend, I would be horrified to find a dog on a tree like that. So this was a major, major red flag of Jeffrey. No one who just like bones would ever do a prank like that. Like, that's not a prank. That was a warning sign. Jeffrey continued to preserve animal bones and build his obsession. And while this was going on, Joyce was taking large amounts of pills that it was crazy. She did not spend time with Jeffrey the way that she should have because she was going through depression and she didn't notice these warning signs most likely because she was in her own world. So that was what was happening at that time. During this time, Jeffrey was also starting high school and he was seen as an outcast. He didn't really have that many friends. He was kind of just like to himself. But a concerning warning sign is at the age of 14, he began drinking beer and hard alcohol during the day and hid it in his jacket that he wore to school. So he was drinking during school. Drinking in general, just at a young age, is already damaging, but the fact that he's doing it during school says a lot. His classmates asked why he was drinking. Like, what do you gain from doing that? And he said it was his medicine. Though he was drinking, his grades at the time were above average, and he was nice to the staff. Even when he didn't talk, he just was considered nice, even though he was shy. He did play tennis and played in the band for a little while. But this is also the time of puberty, discovering yourself, and he discovered that he was gay. But he didn't tell his parents, so that's kind of something that he kept to himself. But he did have a relationship with the boy while in high school, and him and the boy did not have sexual intercourse at all. It was just like a little high school relationship. This kind of, discovering himself turned a little downhill because in his mid-teens, he began fascinating about dominating and controlling a submissive male. And he masturbated to the thoughts of male chests and torsos, and his fantasies turned into an obsession, which also involved dissecting bodies. And at the age of 16, Jeffrey had a fantasy about a male jogger, and he had vivid sexual fantasies about this jogger. So he wanted to act on this fantasy and make it a reality. So one day, Jeffrey hid in the bushes with the bat to wait for the jogger. He didn't know what he was going to do. He just knew he wanted the jogger. But luckily that day, the jogger did not pass, and Jeffrey did not get to proceed with what he was going to do. This was his first attempt to, ever assault someone. And after that, it only went downhill. He also started to become like a class clown, started pulling pranks, just, trying to get attention. And he did something called doing a Dahmer, which he mimicked seizures and cerebral palsy. Despite his, shy personality, he did this, at public places, like school, stores, he did this. This was kind of like a sign that he wanted attention, and he got the attention because his classmates were laughing and enjoying this behavior. But at this time, Jeffrey's grades were also declining very badly. So his parents hired him a private tutor, but that didn't really help him. It just wasn't working out for him, to say the least. And this same year, 1977, Jeffrey's parents decided to take marriage counseling, but this failed when Lionel found out that Joyce was having an affair, and they decided to have a divorce. And Lionel moved out in 1978. So this was kind of like a major mark in Jeffrey's life. He always heard his parents arguing, always heard them fight, felt neglected, and now they're divorced. This is like a big moment in his life. This same year, Jeffrey was caught drinking by his high school parking lot, and his teacher threatened to report him, but Dahmer, he convinced the teacher not to do it because, his family problems, and he was like, I'm going through it, my parents just divorced, I'm sad, and the teacher, I guess, didn't report him. In the same year, 1978, is when Jeffrey finally graduated from high school. So Jeffrey graduated, and Joyce and David, that spring of when he graduated, moved out the family home and somewhere else in Wisconsin. And Jeffrey wanted to stay in the family home. That's what he liked. He loved the family home. And he stayed there. And this is like a big part of Jeffrey's life. Like this home, because 3 weeks after he decided to, stay in this home, so after he graduated, he committed his first murder. So his first murder was on June 18th. And Jeffrey was driving around, and he saw a hitchhiker, so he picked him up, and the hitchhiker's name was Stephen Hicks. And Jeffrey convinced Stephen to go back to his house so that they could have alcohol, drink, talk, and Stephen agreed. Stephen just came from a concert, he was feeling good, he was like, why not? So, as we know, Jeffrey has a bunch of fantasies, and his fantasies increased when he saw Stephen. He had his bare chest out, standing on the road, and Jeffrey was very much interested. And while they were talking, Stephen kept mentioning girls, this. And Jeffrey knew at that time that Stephen and him weren't going to do anything or be anything because he wasn't interested in guys that he knew of. And he knew that he would be rejected. So when they arrived at Jeffrey's house, they began, talking, listening to music, drinking, and Steven kind of felt a weird vibe. He wanted to go. He had enough. He wanted to go home. But Jeffrey didn't want him to leave. So Jeffrey hit Steven with a 10-pound dumbbell, and he was knocked out. He hit Steven twice while Steven was sat down on the couch/chair, and once Steven was knocked out, Jeffrey strangled him with the bar of the dumbbell to make sure he was dead. And when Steven was dead, Jeffrey stripped Steven of his clothes and then masturbated while looking at the dead body of Steven. And this was his first murder. The next day after the murder, Jeffrey hid Steven's body in the basement of the family home and buried the remains in a shallow grave. A couple weeks later, he dug up the body and dissolved the flesh with acid and poured the flesh and acid mixture down the toilet. And then once he had the bones, he crushed them up with the sledgehammer and scattered it in the wooded area by his home. So that August of the same year, Jeffrey enrolled in Ohio State University, but then dropped out after only 3 months. And this was because he was addicted to alcohol. It was taking over his life, and he was going down a really destructive path. This alcohol was changing him dramatically. So he kind of did his own thing for a while. But then, on January in 1979, Jeffrey enlisted in the Army, but then he was discharged honorably due to his alcohol abuse. And then Jeffrey kind of did his own thing again. And in 1981, Jeffrey traveled to Miami, Florida to kind of, find himself, gain independence, and get away from the cold. And he found a job working in a deli, and he stayed in a motel. When he was in the hotel, he was not paying money. So, he got evicted because he wasn't paying. And he spent a lot of his salary on alcohol. That's why he could not pay his rent. So he got evicted, but he did keep working at the deli. But then he returned to Ohio in September of the same year and stayed with his father and his stepmom. While he was staying with his father and his stepmom, he was still drinking heavily, and he got arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct and was fined $60 and had a suspended 10-day sentence. And in that December, Jeffrey's father and stepmom sent him to live with his grandma in Wisconsin because his grandma is the only person that he really showed lots of affection for. And Lionel thought that this would be a good opportunity for Jeffrey to get his life back on track, get himself together. And, at the start, it was working out. Jeffrey, he did his chores, he went to church, he tried to work, he followed her rules, but he did continue to drink and smoke. But he was doing his work. In 1982, Jeffrey was a phlebotomist, and, that was working out until, 10 months later, he got laid off. But before he lost his job, he was arrested for indecent exposure at a Wisconsin state park and received a fine of $50, plus the court cost. And after he got fired and everything, he remained unemployed and literally lived off the money that his grandma gave him. But, he tried to get his life back on track and got a job in 1985. And he was hired as a mixer in the chocolate factory, which I think is a really cool job. And after his employment, something happened. A man in a library passed a note to Jeffrey offering to give him fellatio, but Dahmer declined, and after this note situation, he was kind of like going back to what he was like as a teenager. And his fantasies, they came back. And after this, he went to a lot of gay bars, bathhouses, and bookstores. And he frequently went to bathhouses. And he said that they were kind of relaxing. But one thing that he just really didn't enjoy was that his partners would always move during any kind of acts. And this bothered him because he wanted them to be fully submissive, like a dead person. So he tried to act on his fantasies again. In 1986, he gave his sleeping partners sleeping pills and laced their drinks with sedatives, all that stuff, because he wanted them to fall asleep before they did anything sexual so they could be completely submissive to him. And he kept getting these pills because he told his doctors that he was unable to sleep due to the hours that he worked, his schedule. And they gave it to him, and he did not use them to sleep. He used them to, lace people. And, people caught up to his shenanigans, and he got kicked out the bathhouse after 12 incidents occurred. So, instead of bathhouses, he decided to go to hotels and started doing the same things, but just in a hotel. So, while he was doing this, a little while later, Jeffrey was reading an article of a man that passed away, and he was having a funeral, and Jeffrey attempted to dig up the man's body, dig up the coffin and take the body home. But, luckily, this plan failed because he said the soil was too hard. I'm so thankful that he said it was too hard, because I would feel so bad for that family. Noticing that their body is missing. That's crazy. And that, same year on September 8th, Jeffrey was arrested for lewd and lascivious behavior for masturbating in front of two 12-year-old boys. And, he tried to say he was urinating, peeing, and he just did not notice that there were people that were right there looking at him, And we all know that this is a lie. But anyways, he was charged to disorderly conduct and was sentenced to 1 year of probation and to seek counseling. So on November 20th, 1987, Jeffrey saw a 25-year-old man whose name was also Stephen, and we're going to call him Stephen T just to make it a little easier. So he met Stephen T at a bar and persuaded him to go back to the hotel that he was staying, which is called the Ambassador Hotel. And, according to Jeffrey, he didn't want to murder Stephen, just to drug him a little bit and explore his body while he was drugged, which doesn't make it any better, but, That morning after, Jeffrey said he woke up to find Stephen T laying beneath him on the bed with his chest crushed in. And Stephen T's body had black and blue bruises all over, and blood was coming from the corner of his mouth, and Jeffrey's fists and forearm were bruised really, really bad. And according to Jeffrey, he said that he had no memory of killing Stephen T. And he just could not believe that this horrific thing has happened. But instead of, turning himself in, you know what Jeffrey did? He disposed Stephen T's body and he purchased a large suitcase and transported the body to his grandmother's house. Then a week later after the murder, he severed the head, arms, and legs from the torso. Then, filleted the bones from the body before cutting Stephen T's flesh into small pieces. Then Jeffrey proceeded to place the flesh inside of a plastic-like garbage bags and wrapped the bones inside a sheet and pounded them with a sledgehammer. And this process took like 2-ish hours, and then he disposed of all of Stephen T's remains. And this included the severed head. But 2 weeks following the murder, Jeffrey kept Stephen T's head wrapped in a blanket, and then with Stephen T's head, Jeffrey boiled the head and with bleach and an alkali-based detergent to get the skull and preserve it, because he used the skull for masturbation, but the skull was too brittle by the bleaching process, so he just got rid of it and no remains were ever found. This started his killing spree, and he committed a lot more murders. So I'm going to go into detail about the murders. So the next one after, in January 16th, 1988, James, who was 14 years old, met Jeffrey outside of a gay bar in Wisconsin, and Jeffrey lured James because he was like, hey, do you want $50 for nude pictures? You just have to pose. And James agreed. And then Jeffrey strangled James and kept his body in the basement for a week before dismembering him and discarding the remains in the trash. And no remains of James were ever found. Then, that same year, on March 24th, Richard, who was 22 at the time, was drugged and strangled in Jeffrey's bedroom. And Jeffrey dismembered Richard's corpse in the basement and dissolved his flesh in acid and disposed of the bones in the trash. And he bleached and retained the skull for several months before getting rid of it, and no remains were ever found. So the following year, in 1989, on March 25th, Anthony, who was 24, was the last victim of Jeffrey to be drugged. So not the last victim, but the last victim to be drugged and strangled at Jeffrey's grandmother's home. And he was the first victim who Jeffrey permanently retained the body parts. He preserved his skull and genitals, and these were all found in a filing cabinet once Jeffrey was arrested. So the following year after that, May 20th, 1990, Raymond, 32, was the first victim of Jeffrey's to be killed at his new apartment. And Raymond was a male sex worker who Jeffrey had talked to a little bit. And Jeffrey laced Raymond's drink with sleeping pills and then strangled him on the kitchen floor of his apartment. And his skull was spray painted and kept. That same year, on June 14th, Edward, who was 27, was, a known acquaintance, I wouldn't say friend, but acquaintance of Jeffrey, who was last seen in Jeffrey's company at a party. So Jeffrey acidified Edward's skeleton and his skull was destroyed unintentionally. This wasn't on purpose because Jeffrey wanted to keep it, but Jeffrey put his skull in the oven to remove the moisture, and no remains were ever found. That same year again, September 2nd, Ernest, 22 at the time, was a dance student who Jeffrey encountered outside a bookstore, and Jeffrey was attracted to Ernest's physique. He really liked that. He was so attracted to him. So he killed Ernest by severing his artery before dismembering him in the bathtub. And Jeffrey stored his entire skeleton in the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet. His heart, biceps, pieces of his legs in the freezer were found so he could eat it, for consumption. That same year, September 24th, David, 22 at the time, found Jeffrey near a mall, and he was lured to Jeffrey's apartment because Jeffrey promised him money for posing nude, and he made David unconscious by lacing his drink, and Jeffrey said he wasn't his type. So, what Jeffrey did, he killed David and strangled him, and then took Polaroid photos of the whole entire process, and no remains were ever found of David. So the following year, February 18th, 1991, Curtis, 17 at the time, was approached by Jeffrey while he was waiting at a bus stop, and Jeffrey lured Curtis to his apartment, and he was drugged and handcuffed and strangled before being dismembered in the bathtub, and his skull, hands, and genitals were still at Jeffrey's apartment and retained. That same year, on April 7th, Errol who was 19 at the time, was the first victim of Jeffrey's that, Jeffrey described as the drilling technique. So Errol was the first person who Jeffrey practiced this on. This is a procedure where he drilled holes into the victim's skull and injected hydrochloric acid into the brain. And according to Jeffrey, Errol awoke, he woke up, and then he went unconscious. And this was because Jeffrey laced his drink with sedatives and then strangled him to death. Then Jeffrey cut Errol's body and kept the skin for several weeks, and his skull was found. This same year, he committed another murder. May 24th, Tony, who was 31 at the time, was lured because Jeffrey, like he always does, promises to give money to people for posing nudes, and Tony was deaf, and they communicated by writing to each other, so handwritten notes and stuff. He was strangled, and his body was left on Jeffrey's bedroom floor for 3 days before being dismembered. And Jeffrey was taking pictures of the process with Polaroids, and his skull was retained, so Jeffrey kept the skull. So that same year, on May 27th, Honorak, who was 14, was the younger brother of a person that Jeffrey assaulted in 1988. Konorak was drugged and also had hydrochloric acid injected into his brain. So Jeffrey left Konorak unattended because Jeffrey wanted to purchase beer. So when he returned, he discovered that Konorak was naked and disoriented, all shaken up in the street, and 3 young women were trying to help him, and they called the police. They were like, "Oh no, what is going on?" And so the police arrived, and Jeffrey persuaded them that Konorak and him were lovers, and he was just intoxicated. And the police left Konorak with Jeffrey, and then Jeffrey injected hydrochloric acid again into Konorak's brain, and this was fatal. And his head was retained in the freezer, and his body was dismembered. This same year, June 30th, Matt, who was 20 at the time, was at a bus stop, and Jeffrey came up to him and persuaded him to come pose for a photo shoot. And Matt was drugged, strangled, and then dismembered in the bathtub. And his head and internal organs were put in the freezer, and his torso was placed in the 57-gallon drum that Jeffrey purchased. That same year, on July 5th, Jeremiah, who's 23, met Jeffrey at a gay bar and agreed to come to Milwaukee for the weekend with Jeffrey. And Jeffrey drilled a hole through Jeremiah's skull and injected boiling water into the cavity. And he said that Jeremiah's death was exceptional. That was his own words. And he was the only victim who died with his eyes open, and Jeremiah's body was decapitated and kept in the bathtub for a week before being dismembered, and his torso was placed in the 57-gallon drum. July 15th, that same year, Oliver, a bodybuilding enthusiast who Jeffrey, lured into the apartment on the promise of money for photographs, was drugged. Oliver, he was drugged and strangled with a leather strap before being decapitated, with his head and heart being placed in the refrigerator. His skeleton was like a shrine, and Jeffrey was like creating a shrine with his skeleton. Just a whole hot mess. And July 19th of that same year, Joseph, 25, who was Jeffrey's last victim, was a father of 3 children and was just looking for work in Milwaukee at the time of the murder. And he was left on Jeffrey's bed for 2 days following the murder. And then he was decapitated, and his head was placed in the refrigerator, and his torso in the 57-gallon drum. This was the end of his murdering spree. So, let's get into this arrest, because he needed to be arrested, child. He was a whole hot mess. Jeffrey, listen, he needs to know. So, Jeffrey, on July 22nd of the same year, 1991, he approached 3 men with the offer of $100 to accompany him to pose for nude photographs and drink beer and just keep him company. And one of the trio, 32-year-old Tracy, agreed to go to his apartment. And when Tracy entered Jeffrey's apartment, Tracy noticed that, it smelled a little smelled a little weird. And he also saw boxes of hydrochloric acid, and he was like, I don't know about this one. And Jeffrey claimed he was using them for cleaning bricks. Like, come on now. Come up with a better lie. But anyways, So after this conversation, Tracy turned his head a little and Jeffrey proceeded to place a handcuff on Tracy's hand. And Tracy was like, what is going on? What's happening? And, Jeffrey failed. Thankfully, he unsuccessfully attempted to cusp his wrists together, then tried to tell Tracy to come to the bedroom and pose for the pictures. And, Tracy walked a little scared, a little shook up though. And then Tracy noticed that he had nude male posters on the wall and a videotape of The Exorcist was playing, and he noticed a 57-gallon drum in the corner where the odor was coming from. So, he was a little shook up, to say the least. And then Jeffrey took a knife out and said that he was going to take nude photos of Tracy. So, Tracy was he was trying to act quickly. So he was trying to, be compliant to Jeffrey. So he unbuttoned his shirt, saying that he will allow him to do what he wanted to do if he removed the handcuffs and put the knife away. So Jeffrey turned his attention to the TV and complied. And they just sat together, and Tracy observed that Jeffrey was walking back and forth and chanting before turning his attention back to Tracy. And he placed his head on Tracy's chest, listening to his heartbeat, but then had the knife to his chest and said that, "I'll eat your heart." So Tracy knew he had to get out. And he tried to prevent Jeffrey from attacking him. So Tracy said that he was Jeffrey's friend. I'm your friend, I'm your friend, I'm your friend. And he wasn't going to run away. And Tracy sensed that Jeffrey wanted somebody. He was lonely. So, Tracy decided that he was going to either jump from a window or run through the unlocked door when he had the opportunity. And then Tracy said that he had to use the bathroom, and he asked Jeffrey if, he could use the bathroom. And they walked to the bathroom, and Tracy exited. So then they went inside the living room, and Tracy waited and observed Jeffrey. So, he waited for Jeffrey to be so concentrated on the movie, and then asked to use the bathroom again. And so Tracy got up to act like he was using the bathroom, and he noticed that Jeffrey was, not holding the handcuffs, not paying attention. So when Tracy got up to act like he was using the bathroom, he punched Jeffrey in the face, knocking Jeffrey off balance, and then he ran out the front door. So at 11:30 p.m. on July 22nd, Tracy, he flagged down 2 police officers and was like, "Hey, oh my gosh, there is," he said in his words, "a freak that had handcuffed him," and asked if the police could remove them. And the officers were like, "The key doesn't fit, so we're going to have to go back inside and, fix this little incident." They didn't know what they were about to get into, the officers. They didn't know that it was about to be one of the most crucial moments in catching a killer. So the officers arrived at the apartment, and Jeffrey was trying to be charming and invited them inside. And he was like, "Yeah, I did put handcuffs on Tracy." But he said, "I'll give you an explanation on why I didn't." But then Tracy was like, "Oh, no. He just pulled up a knife on me, and he tried to kill me and tried to get my heart." And then Jeffrey just didn't acknowledge that he said that. And, you know, he was talking about the handcuffs again, and the officers were kind of looking around because they knew something was going on too. So they were walking around and they entered his bedroom, and Jeffrey attempted to pass the officer. So as they were walking in the bedroom, Jeffrey was behind the officer, so he tried to pass the officer to get the key. But then the second officer that was there was like, back off, let him do what he needs to do. So the officer noticed that there was definitely a knife, a large knife beneath the bed, and he saw an open drawer. Then he saw in the drawer Polaroid pictures of human bodies that were dismembered. And he showed his partner and was like, these are really real. And, Jeffrey saw this and he was like, oh, yikes. So he tried to fight his arrest. And so the officers quickly, cuffed him, put his hands behind his back. They called a second squad car, and he was done. But the officers wanted to investigate more. Then they investigated his refrigerator, saw the freshly severed head of a black male on the bottom shelf. And while Jeffrey was on the floor, Jeffrey turned his head and said, "For what I did, I should be dead." And this was crazy to the officers. They were investigating his apartment up and down. They discovered blood drippings. There was plastic bags of arm muscles, 2 human hearts. The freezer was crazy. It had torsos, organs, flesh stuck to the ice. He was done, and Jeffrey got arrested that same day. And also, with the Polaroid pictures, he had 74 total Polaroid pictures. That is crazy. 74, just one would be more than enough. You shouldn't have any. But the fact that he had 74, that's that's wow. So I'm going to dive a little bit into his court case, but not too much, just because most of the information is it's online, it's everywhere because this is such a popular case. But he was charged with 15 counts of murder, and that's crazy. That's such a crazy amount. Even one, like I said, would be more than enough, but 15 is crazy. But he was also assessed by a psychiatrist, and he was diagnosed with necrophilia, borderline personality disorder, alcohol dependence, and a psychotic disorder. He had a lot going on, but that doesn't excuse his actions because there are plenty of people who suffer with these disorders and these mental health problems, but they don't commit murder. So that's never an excuse for anyone. He was also sentenced to life imprisonment, and I would like to get into something he said when he was baptized. He said, was he sinning against God by continuing to live? This and other statements that he said show that he knows what he did was wrong and he wants to die. He's so accepting of death because he knows that what he did was wrong, and living with that is hurting him. But that's just something that I wanted to pick up on. Jeffrey died the morning of November 28th, 1994. So what happened was Jeffrey was leaving his cell to do his work, and two inmates followed him, Jesse and Christopher, and the trio were left unsupervised for about 20 minutes, and at 8:10 a.m. approximately, Dahmer was found on the floor suffering from extreme head wounds. It was really bad. And he had been hit in the face with a 20-inch metal bar, and his head had also been repeatedly struck against the wall in assault. And Dahmer was still alive, and he was rushed to a nearby hospital, but he was pronounced dead an hour later. And Jesse had also been beaten with the same instrument and died 2 days later from his wounds. And Christopher was assigned 2 life sentences for killing both of them, but he was already serving a life sentence. And Christopher said that God told him to do it. And he also said that Jeffrey, when he was getting beat, he accepted it. He was quiet, and he just accepted it and kind of just let him be murdered. In Dahmer's will, he said that he doesn't want any services to be conducted, and he wished to be cremated. And his ashes were given to his parents. So that was the end of Jeffrey. And now I want to dive in a little more into his brain. Let's get inside his mind. So we got all this information on Jeffrey. Let's look a little deeper. So we already know that he was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, and psychotic disorder, alcohol dependency. And we also know that he accepted his death and he wanted to die. He knew what he did was wrong, and he said on multiple counts that he would like to die. But these personality disorders do not excuse him from what he did. Like I said before, people suffer from this every single day, but they do not kill people. So that is nowhere near an excuse. But I would kind of like to dive in to see why this might have happened and how we could stop this from happening in the future. And just noticing the signs. So, as we know, in his childhood, he was neglected a lot. His parents were never really around emotionally for him. He just wasn't getting what he should have, which kind of caused him to be very shy, timid, and kind of put off from the world. He also began drinking heavily at 14 years old, which causes a bunch of damage to your brain. If you're 14 years old drinking constantly every day, that does a lot to your mind. And like I said earlier, he said that drinking was his medicine. He wanted to be healed. He felt like he needed to be healed because he was being neglected. And in my personal opinion, I feel like he felt alone. But this, like I said, does not excuse anything because people feel alone all the time. But this definitely was a sign of things going wrong with Jeffrey that I feel like if he would have gotten help at an earlier age, like went to counseling on a everyday basis and had someone to talk to and protect him, watch him, make sure he was okay, I think things could have went a lot differently. Another thing is that his father didn't know about his whole fascination with bones. So because his father didn't know, his father kind of fueled his fascination with bones, and this developed into his sexual fantasy, his sexual life, and he wanted to be involved with bones. That's what he liked. He liked bones. And this showed when he committed his murders, and saved the skeletons. I feel like his over fascination with bones, plus his charges like indecent exposure, his timid personality, him wanting to crave attention, shows a bunch of different signs that were red flags. And if these red flags were addressed, he could have gotten help and could have prevented so many murders and could have prevented a bunch of men from being killed by Jeffrey. This is like a really big thing, and the mental health community is noticing the warning signs because a lot of people tend to not pick up on the warning signs, and that leads to so many problems. Not even just murder, but just it could lead into something else, like a deeper, more harmful disorder. It could lead into so many different things if you don't notice these warning signs and act on it. So I feel like if Jeffrey at a young age started going maybe to a mental hospital, maybe to counseling, this he could have been prevented. This is an example of why mental illness is like, it's so important to treat and just be aware that it's real life. This happens because it could save lives. Not only the person who has the mental illness, but the other people that it may affect. And like I said, though he had these mental illnesses, this does not excuse the actions that he did, nor will it ever excuse anyone else's actions. And if you have any opinions, please reach out and let me know. And also, if you have more cases that you would like me to look at, please email insidethemindtruecrime@gmail.com or at IamManirame on Instagram. I'll also leave it in the description. That is all today, so make sure to take care of your mind. Watch out for early warning signs. If you are feeling depressed, please talk to a therapist or call the National Suicide Hotline at 800-273-8255. The information, credits for this episode, go to Wikipedia, Psychology Today, The Washington Post, Crime Museum, and Biography.com. Keep that mind healthy and positive. Catch you later.